Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons, and we're going to talk about fantasy, and we're going to talk about what fantasy builds. So, so I'll give you I'll expand it more to explain what we're going to talk about today. Today we're going to talk about California's bullet train, which is pure fantasy, but is actually very much. But the project is building. It's building like crazy. It's building tons of stuff, right? And so it's proof, in my humble opinion, that fantasy is the most is I'm going to say flat out. I think fantasy is the most powerful building platform in the world now. It's just not understood. It's massively misunderstood, just like Dungeons and Dragons. All right, so Dungeons and Dragons, its core element is fantasy. Okay, so what is fantasy? Let's define fantasy. Fantasy is the activity of imagining things, especially the improbable. Okay, and I'll tell you right now, by that definition, trust and believe that what you are seeing right now in California is fantasy. The California bullet train is fantasy. Now, the reason we know this is the New York Times. The New York Times just did a huge piece on, and I'd link, but it's like under a paywall. So I'm not going to link, sorry. So basically, they did a huge piece on the California bullet train. And the California bullet train, this thing started up in like 2008. That was a serious start. It's arguable it started even before then. But we have been dealing with this for 14 years. And right now, it literally is a fantasy, right? It's just there's nothing real except some track that no bullet train travels over. And a whole lot of talk in California, a whole lot of projects, and a whole lot of money, right? Money. Billions. $33 billion at the start. The current estimates for its finish are $115 billion. Okay? Now, what astounds me is I've been tracking this forever. Like, True Detective actually did, like, True Detective is a fiction story that really indicated people have already, that gave a lot of clues that people have already died over this project. Multiple people, right? Like, very interesting, right? In my humble opinion, that's what you know. If you watched the Colin Farrell season of True Detective, they were really clearly talking about the California bullet train, right? And it was a murder mystery. Like, oh, that's very interesting. You know, like it was really fascinating. And it's also interesting. I just learned this term. I was in a bookstore and I was I got to people watch people cooler than me, and they were talking about autofiction. And autofiction is when you just write your own life and you just change the names. It's, you call it fiction, but it's not fiction at all, right? Scott McCallaghan is one of these autofiction authors. He's an Appalachian writer. Very interesting guy. Quite unpretentious, but also incredibly educated. It's very interesting writing. So, all right, so you have all this, right? And here's the thing. Like, the New York Times openly discussed it. They're like, no one, you would be hard-pressed to find anyone who believes that the California bullet train will ever exist, right? Like that the rail, this 2 hour and 40-minute rail from two important California cities, city to city, as it was originally envisioned, will ever exist, right? So this is 14 years old, right? And I've known this been a boondoggle forever, right? But what astounded me is I thought it had stopped, right? Like, this is a fantasy. Everybody involved knows that nothing's getting built, right? But there's $1.8 million every day being spent on work that will not produce what was ever originally envisioned by anyone's even remote perspective, right? So it's fantasy. They are going about the activity of imagining a thing that is highly improbable. It's fantasy. The California bullet train is fantasy. So you would expect that fantasy would produce nothing. And this is Dungeons and Dragons. People are like, oh, that's a little fantasy game. It will produce nothing. And I am telling you, it will produce everything. Everything valuable that is coming in the future for the seculars will come from Dungeons and Dragons because it's the most misunderstood force on the planet. Okay? And you know what? So what is the California bullet train building right now? It's building massive wealth for people who don't give two figs about a single railroad car. It is building huge wealth for a huge number of people who don't care about railroads. It's building tons of stuff, right? Like it's building wealth for people, right? That's abstract. It's hard to understand, right? But it is absolutely building. Right? This fantasy of the California bullet train is building massive wealth for large amounts of people. It's fascinating. Hard to understand. Abstract, but real. Fantasy that is really building, right? And it's doing it in plain sight and nobody even understands what's happening, right? That's the fascinating part. Okay. Now, where do we land with all this, right? So, let me give you another example of fantasy that is actually building. All right, Amazon Prime, Jeff Bezos, Prime Video. What a ridiculous joke. Until fantasy made it real, right? Prime Video is one of the most trash streaming services ever. It has Tolkien's work now, and it is becoming real. And fantasy is building a new streaming service that is not a laughable joke, but a real force that is actually putting House of the Dragon in the dirt, outperforming it, and already has a 5-year contract, while House of the Dragon, you don't even know who will own it next year, right? Lord of the Rings has crushed, humiliated, embarrassed House of the Dragon. They are head on, and Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power, despite the quartering, despite nerderotic, despite 100 conservative, highly prejudiced, in my humble opinion, streamers, is winning. And that fantasy is building a real streaming network where Jeff Bezos could not get traction. Fantasy actually builds. And this is the point. Dungeons and Dragons is taking us to a new space, and it is building right now. You can't see it, you can't understand it because it's abstract and it's difficult to understand. But fantasy builds. Fantasy builds. It is the most powerful force on the planet. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson just did an interview. He has said openly, the Republicans and the Democrats have begged me to run. He stars in fantasy. He is a celebrity. He has no real power, and both sides are begging him to rule the earth. Fantasy builds. You just don't see it yet. Well, that's my humble opinion. I'd love to hear yours. Let me know in the comments below. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.